They say the Knights Templar left behind treasure, gold, jewels, sacred relics hidden across Europe. But what if I told you the real treasure wasn't gold at all? What if the most dangerous thing the Templars ever possessed was a book? Not the Bible, not ancient Gospels, but something far older. Something that, if you believed its contents, would shatter everything you think you know about human history. In 1307, when the French king's soldiers stormed Templar strongholds across Europe, they found vast wealth, but they never found what they were truly searching for: a single book. A manuscript so dangerous that popes ordered its destruction, kings killed to possess it, and the Templars died rather than reveal its location. This wasn't a book about God or faith. It was a book about power, real power, the kind that doesn't come from armies or gold, but from knowledge so ancient and so revolutionary that it threatened every throne, every church, every structure of medieval authority. The book had a name, whispered in secret chambers and encoded in Templar architecture across Europe: the Codex Sanguinis, the Book of Blood. And if the legends are true, it still exists, hidden, waiting, containing secrets that could change everything we believe about who we are and where we came from. This is not another story about Templar gold. This is about the knowledge they died protecting, and why that knowledge is more valuable and more dangerous than any treasure chest filled with coins. Let's start with what we think we know about the Knights Templar and their secrets. The popular stories talk about the Holy Grail, the Ark of the Covenant, treasure buried beneath Scottish chapels. These legends have fueled centuries of speculation, novels, movies, and conspiracy theories. But they miss the point entirely, because the Templars' greatest secret wasn't an object you could hold in your hands. It was information that could rewire your understanding of reality itself. The Codex Sanguinis, the Book of Blood, was reportedly discovered by the first Templar Knights during their excavations beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem between 1119 and 1128. But here's what makes this discovery different from all the legendary artifacts. Multiple independent sources describe it in remarkably consistent terms, despite being separated by centuries in geography. Medieval chronicles, Templar trial transcripts, Arab historians, and even suppressed Vatican documents all reference a book written on metal, or pages that glow with inner light, found in the deepest chambers beneath Solomon's temple. Think about that for a moment. We're not talking about parchment or papyrus, materials that were common in the medieval world. We're talking about metal pages. Chronicles describe sheets of a silvery metal, thin as parchment but impossibly durable, bound together through means that medieval observers couldn't understand. There were no visible bindings, no thread, no rivets, yet the pages held together in a coherent book that could be opened and read. But the material itself wasn't the shocking part. It was what was written on those metal pages. According to testimony extracted during the Templar trials, testimony that the Church worked desperately to suppress, the Codex contained information in multiple languages, some recognizable to medieval scholars, others completely unknown. The text wasn't simply written on the surface. Knights who handled it reported that the writing seemed to shift depending on who was reading it, as if the book adapted its presentation to the reader's ability to comprehend. Touch the pages and knowledge would flow directly into your mind, bypassing the normal process of reading and interpretation. This sounds like fantasy, like medieval superstition, but consider the consistency of the reports. Templars being tortured in different cities, interrogated by different inquisitors with no way to coordinate their stories, all described the same basic phenomenon: a metal book with text that seemed alive, responsive, almost intelligent. They called it different names: the Book of Blood, the Book of Shadows, the Book of Adam,
but the description remained essentially identical. So what exactly did this book contain? The Templar trial records provide disturbing hints. Under torture, knights confessed to learning forbidden knowledge from ancient texts recovered in Jerusalem. They spoke of genetic memories, though they wouldn't have used that exact term, inherited knowledge passed through bloodlines from ancient ancestors. They described awakening experiences, where touching the book triggered visions of civilizations that existed before any recorded history, technologies that shouldn't have been possible in the ancient world, and most controversial of all, the true origins of humanity. According to the Codex, as described by those who claimed to have read it, humanity wasn't simply the product of natural evolution or divine creation as the Church taught. Instead, it was the result of deliberate genetic engineering by an advanced civilization. The text was frustratingly vague about whether this meant visitors from elsewhere or a previous advanced human culture that had been destroyed in some ancient catastrophe. This advanced civilization had modified certain human bloodlines, introducing genetic sequences that lay dormant across generations until deliberately activated. These modified humans, the text allegedly called them hybrids, possessed capabilities that would seem supernatural to ordinary people: enhanced intelligence, extended lifespans, the ability to access ancestral memories encoded in their DNA, even abilities to perceive and manipulate forces that mainstream science wouldn't begin to understand for centuries. The great leaders of ancient civilizations, the pharaohs of Egypt, the god-kings of Mesopotamia, the mysterious builders of megalithic structures, weren't divine beings or simply exceptional humans. They were the activated carriers of this ancient genetic modification. But here's where the Codex's narrative becomes truly revolutionary and threatening to medieval power structures. It claimed that this knowledge and these genetic modifications hadn't vanished with the ancient world. They had been deliberately preserved, scattered and hidden across human populations, maintained through secret lineages and bloodlines that most people didn't even know they belonged to. The knowledge was being protected by one faction, the Guardians, who believed in gradually uplifting all of humanity to the same enhanced level, and it was being suppressed by the Controller faction, who wanted to maintain the genetic advantages for themselves, using their superior capabilities to rule over ordinary humans. This wasn't just esoteric mythology. This was a blueprint for understanding power in the medieval world, and potentially in any era. The Codex suggested that the great institutions of human civilization, empires, churches, kingdoms, were actually fronts in an ancient genetic war between these two factions. The controllers had learned that ruling openly as god kings invited rebellion, so they adapted, working through proxies, infiltrating existing power structures, manipulating from the shadows. The Catholic Church, according to this narrative, had been systematically infiltrated and guided by controller faction representatives who shaped Christian theology specifically to suppress knowledge of human genetic potential. Think about the implications. If ordinary people learned that divine authority wasn't granted by God, but was actually genetic capability that could theoretically be activated in anyone, what would happen to the entire medieval social order? If peasants discovered that the nobility's right to rule wasn't divine birthright, but actually stolen genetic advantages that were being deliberately kept from the masses, how long would the feudal system survive? If Christians learned that Jesus wasn't unique, but was one of many individuals across history who had successfully activated the full potential of the genetic modifications, what would happen to church authority?
This is why the Codex was so dangerous. It wasn't just challenging religious doctrine, it was providing an alternative explanation for human inequality, power structures, and the nature of authority itself. It suggested that the hierarchies medieval people took for granted weren't natural or divinely ordained, but were the result of ancient genetic manipulation, combined with centuries of deliberate suppression of knowledge. The book allegedly contained practical information as well. Not just historical narrative, but actual techniques. Methods for awakening dormant genetic sequences, practices for accessing ancestral memories, instructions for recognizing others who carried the bloodline markers, even formulas for medicines, architectural principles, and mathematical knowledge that were supposedly preserved from the advanced civilization that had created the genetic modifications in the first place. This is what made the Codex valuable to the Templars and terrifying to their enemies. It wasn't a religious text that you could simply declare heretical and burn. It was practical knowledge that demonstrably worked, if you believed the accounts. Templars who underwent the awakening process described in the book reported experiencing visions of ancient knowledge, accessing information they had no normal way of knowing, developing enhanced abilities of perception and cognition. Whether this was genuine genetic activation, sophisticated psychological techniques, or some combination, the result was the same. Templars who had been exposed to the Codex operated at a level that seemed almost supernatural to outside observers. Their military innovations, their architectural achievements, their financial systems, their rapid rise to power, all of it could be explained if you accepted that they had access to preserved ancient knowledge that gave them systematic advantages over contemporaries. They weren't just lucky or divinely favored. They were applying principles and techniques that were thousands of years more advanced than what mainstream medieval civilization possessed. But possessing such knowledge came with a terrible price. Because if the Codex was right about the ancient genetic war, then the Templars weren't just a medieval military order. They were the latest incarnation of the Guardian faction, inheriting a conflict that had been raging since before recorded history began. And their very existence, their growing power, their possession of the Codex itself, would inevitably draw the attention of the Controller faction that had been working for millennia to suppress exactly this kind of knowledge. The book was a beacon, advertising to anyone with the right knowledge that the Guardian faction had awakened again. The Templars' spectacular success was simultaneously their greatest achievement and their death sentence. Because you cannot possess knowledge that threatens the fundamental basis of medieval power without attracting the attention of those whose authority depends on keeping that knowledge suppressed. The Catholic Church's persecution of the Templars, their torture, their executions, the systematic destruction of their order, was this really about heresy and corruption, as the official charges claimed? Or was it about something much older and much more dangerous? An ancient faction war being fought through medieval proxies, with the Codex Sanguinis as the prize that both sides desperately needed to either protect or destroy. And here's the question that should keep you awake at night. If the Codex was destroyed in 1307 when the Templars fell, why do reports of it keep appearing throughout history? Why do scholars and collectors across the centuries describe encountering a metal book matching its description, always appearing briefly before vanishing again into hiding? What if the Templars succeeded in their most important mission, not protecting pilgrims or accumulating wealth, but ensuring that the Codex survived, hidden somewhere, waiting for a time when humanity might finally be ready to handle the knowledge it contains?
Understanding what made the Codex Sanguinis so revolutionary requires going beyond the basic description of a book written on metal. We need to examine the mechanisms by which it supposedly worked, the interface between ancient technology and human consciousness that made it so much more than a simple manuscript. Medieval accounts of Templars who had directly interacted with the Codex describe an experience that sounds almost like science fiction. You didn't simply read the book in the conventional sense, you engaged with it. Knights testified under interrogation about a ritual process they called the opening, a specific sequence of mental preparation, physical positioning, and direct contact with the metal pages that created what we might today call a consciousness interface.
The process began with meditation techniques designed to alter brainwave patterns. Templars described spending hours in darkness, controlling their breathing, reciting specific tones and frequencies that created physical vibrations in their bodies. This wasn't random mysticism. The instructions were allegedly contained within the codex itself, providing a step-by-step protocol for preparing human neurology to receive the information encoded in its pages. Only after this preparation would the knight place their hands on the metal surface, and here's where the accounts become truly strange. Multiple independent testimonies describe feeling electrical sensations flowing from the pages into their hands, up their arms, and into their consciousness. Not metaphorical electricity, actual physical sensation of energy transfer that left hands tingling for hours afterward. Some knights reported visible phenomena, faint blue-white light appearing at the points of contact, the metal pages becoming warm to the touch, even a subtle humming vibration that could be felt but not quite heard. What happened next sounds like something from a modern neuroscience experiment. Knights described their vision flooding with information, not words appearing on the pages, but data downloading directly into their minds. They would see three-dimensional geometric patterns, hear languages they didn't consciously know but somehow understood, experience memories that weren't their own, walking through ancient cities that no longer existed, watching technologies being operated that medieval minds had no framework to comprehend, accessing mathematical and scientific principles that wouldn't be discovered for centuries. This wasn't reading in any traditional sense. It was data transfer, a direct interface between the information storage system of the codex and the neural networks of the human brain. Knights who underwent the full process reported that the experience was organized in layers. Initial contact provided surface-level information, but repeated exposures revealed deeper strata of knowledge, as if the codex assessed the reader's capacity to comprehend and released information accordingly. But here's what made the codex truly sophisticated. It appeared to adapt to each reader. Chronicles describe how different knights accessing the same passages reported experiencing different information. A knight with military background would receive tactical and strategic knowledge. One with administrative skills would access information about organizational systems and resource management. Someone with scholarly inclinations would experience mathematical and scientific principles. The codex seemed to read the reader, identifying their capabilities and presenting information in the form most useful to their specific cognitive architecture. This adaptive presentation suggests the codex wasn't simply a passive storage medium like parchment or even a modern book. It was an active system, possibly containing what we might today call artificial intelligence, or at minimum, a sophisticated indexing system that responded to user queries even when those queries were only thought rather than spoken. Medieval observers had no framework to understand this technology, so they described it in the only terms they knew: magic, divine revelation, demonic influence, depending on which faction was describing it.
The metal pages themselves presented another mystery. Analysis of descriptions from trial records suggests this wasn't any metal known to medieval metallurgy. It was described as silvery, but warmer in tone than silver, lighter in weight than any metal had a right to be given its thinness, yet completely inflexible and impossible to damage. Knights testified to attempting to cut the pages with steel blades, to burning them with fire. Nothing left any mark. The material seemed inert to physical damage, yet was somehow capable of generating electrical phenomena and displaying changing information. Modern researchers examining these accounts have proposed various theories. Some suggest the codex might have been constructed using techniques from a lost advanced civilization, perhaps something like graphene or other metamaterials that were only beginning to develop today, created by an ancient culture using methods we've forgotten.
Others propose extraterrestrial origin, though the codex itself was purportedly vague on this point, referring only to those who came from elsewhere, without specifying whether this meant geographically, temporally, or literally from another world. What's particularly fascinating is the information architecture described in the codex. It allegedly contained multiple types of knowledge organized in a specific hierarchy. The outer layers, what first-time readers accessed, contained historical narratives, the story of the ancient genetic modifications, the war between Guardian and Controller factions, the methods by which knowledge had been preserved and scattered across human populations. Think of this as the contextual framework necessary to understand everything else. Deeper layers contained practical knowledge, the genetic awakening techniques, methods for accessing ancestral memories encoded in DNA, practices for enhancing cognitive and perceptual abilities. Templars who reached these layers reported dramatic personal transformations, not instant superhuman abilities, but a gradual expansion of their cognitive capacity, enhanced pattern recognition, ability to learn new skills with unusual speed, even changes in their physical health and vitality as dormant genetic sequences supposedly activated. The deepest layers, which only the most advanced practitioners allegedly accessed, contained what trial testimonies described as source knowledge, the fundamental principles of reality, consciousness, and the relationship between mind and matter. Knights who claimed to have reached this level spoke in almost mystical terms about understanding the code beneath the code, the suggestion that physical reality itself operated according to principles that human consciousness could learn to perceive and potentially influence. This hierarchical structure makes sense if you consider the codex as a teaching tool rather than simply a reference book. You couldn't give someone complete access to advanced knowledge without first providing the conceptual foundation to understand it. The codex's adaptive presentation ensured readers progressed through the material at a pace their neurology could integrate without psychological damage. Because here's a crucial detail often overlooked in Templar legends. The awakening process wasn't without dangers. Trial records include testimony about knights who underwent the codex experience too quickly or without proper preparation. They describe psychological breakdowns, men driven to madness by information overload, knights who became catatonic or developed what we might today recognize as severe dissociative disorders. The codex contained knowledge that human neurology wasn't naturally adapted to process. The preparatory techniques and graduated access weren't mystical ritual, they were necessary safety protocols. The Templars developed an entire system around codex usage. Not every member of the order was exposed to it. There was a careful selection process identifying individuals with specific genetic markers and psychological characteristics that indicated they could withstand the awakening experience. These selected individuals underwent years of preparation, meditation training, study of prerequisite knowledge, practices designed to increase neuroplasticity and cognitive resilience. Only after this extensive preparation were they permitted direct contact with the codex. Even then, exposure was carefully controlled. Initial sessions lasted only minutes. Advanced practitioners might spend an hour in direct contact with the pages, but no longer, because extended exposure produced increasingly intense neurological effects that required recovery time to integrate. The most advanced Templars, the Inner Circle, the Council of 13 that legends speak of, were those who had undergone the complete progression through all the layers of the Codex's knowledge. This systematic approach suggests the Templars understood they were working with a technology that was simultaneously immensely valuable and potentially dangerous. They weren't simply treasure hunters who stumbled upon ancient gold. They were inheritors of a sophisticated knowledge transfer system that required careful management to use safely and effectively. The Codex also allegedly contained one other crucial category of information – locations.
Encoded within its pages were the coordinates of other repositories scattered across the globe where additional knowledge had been preserved. This turned the single book into a key, a master index pointing toward a vast network of hidden caches. The codex wasn't meant to contain all the ancient knowledge. That would have been too vulnerable to single-point failure. Instead, it served as a map and instruction manual for accessing the complete library of preserved information. This explains why the Templars expanded so rapidly throughout Europe and the Mediterranean. They weren't just establishing military and financial operations. They were following the map contained in the Codex, locating and securing other repositories, assembling fragments of the scattered knowledge into a more complete picture. Each Templar commandery built at a specific location was not random. It was positioned to protect and access ancient caches that the Codex had revealed. And this is why the Codex's destruction became the absolute priority for those who sought to suppress this knowledge. As long as the book existed, it could guide future generations to all the other repositories. Destroy the Codex, and the map was lost, leaving the scattered knowledge caches hidden and inaccessible. The persecution of the Templars wasn't just about eliminating the men who possessed the knowledge. It was about capturing and destroying the book that could lead others to that knowledge. But did they succeed? The official story says yes, that the Codex was either captured and destroyed by the Church or lost when the last Templars died under torture without revealing its location. But the unofficial story, the one that whispers through secret societies and esoteric traditions across the centuries, suggests something different. It suggests that the Templars, knowing persecution was inevitable, had already implemented their most sophisticated contingency plan. They had hidden the Codex so thoroughly, protected it so cleverly, that it survived the destruction of their order and remains hidden to this day, waiting for the next generation ready to access the ancient knowledge it contains. The question isn't whether the Codex Sanguinis was real. The question is, where is it now? And what would happen if someone found it?
The name Codex Sanguinis, Book of Blood, wasn't random. It pointed to the most controversial and scientifically provocative aspect of the Templar secret, the claim that ancient knowledge wasn't just preserved in books and artifacts, but was literally encoded in human DNA, passed down through specific bloodlines across thousands of years. This concept sounds like modern science fiction, but remember, the Codex allegedly predated our understanding of genetics by millennia. It described inheritance mechanisms and biological information storage in terms that medieval minds translated as bloodlines and lineage, but which might have been describing what we now know as genetic encoding. The Templars, who accessed this information, developed a systematic understanding of heredity that was shockingly advanced for the 12th century. According to testimony extracted during the trials, the Codex described humanity as consisting of multiple, overlapping populations. The vast majority were baseline humans, people who carried only the standard human genetic template. But scattered throughout the population were individuals carrying additional genetic sequences, modifications introduced by the ancient civilization that had engineered the original hybrids. These modifications weren't immediately obvious. They were dormant, inactive, producing no visible effects until triggered by specific environmental factors, training techniques, or direct exposure to technologies like the Codex itself. Think of it like genetic potential waiting to be activated. Everyone carries DNA sequences that never get expressed, genes that remain switched off throughout their lives. The Codex allegedly provided a map of which bloodlines carried these special dormant sequences and, more importantly, how to activate them. This was the real treasure the Templars discovered. Not gold or jewels, but the knowledge of how to identify and awaken enhanced human potential that had been lying dormant in certain family lines for thousands of years. The Templars developed what amounted to a genetic screening program, though they would have described it differently. They weren't looking for divine favor or noble birth in the conventional sense. They were identifying specific heritable traits that indicated bloodline carrier status. These weren't obvious physical characteristics. The markers were subtle, unusual patterns of cognitive ability, specific types of dreams and visions, even biochemical signatures that awakened individuals could supposedly detect through enhanced perception. This explains one of the great mysteries of Templar recruitment. How did an order that officially accepted only nobles manage to identify exceptional individuals so consistently? How did they find men who would prove to be military geniuses, financial innovators, architectural masters? They weren't just lucky. They were systematically identifying genetic markers and recruiting individuals who carried the dormant sequences, even if those individuals had no conscious awareness of their genetic heritage. The recruitment process itself became a form of testing. Potential candidates were observed for signs of carrier status, unusual aptitudes, specific patterns of behavior, even physiological responses to certain stimuli. Those who showed promising indicators were brought into the order and gradually exposed to preliminary awakening techniques. If they responded positively, displaying the enhanced learning ability and perceptual shifts that indicated successful genetic activation, they were brought deeper into the mysteries. If they didn't respond, they remained as regular Templar Knights, valuable soldiers and administrators, but never exposed to the deeper secrets. This created a two-tier organization: the outer Templars, who knew nothing of bloodlines and genetic activation, and the inner circle, the awakened ones, who understood the true nature of what they were protecting. This compartmentalization served multiple purposes. It protected the core secrets from casual exposure, provided plausible deniability if members were captured, and prevented the overwhelming of individuals who weren't genetically prepared to handle the awakening experience. But here's where the Codex's information became genuinely revolutionary. It claimed that these genetic modifications weren't limited to a few noble families or isolated populations. They were scattered broadly across humanity, hidden in peasants and princes alike. The potential for awakening existed in far more people than any ruling elite wanted to acknowledge. Most bloodline carriers lived and died never knowing they possessed dormant capabilities that, if activated, would make them cognitive equals or superiors to those who ruled them. This was the knowledge that terrified medieval power structures. Not that some people were genetically superior, that concept actually supported the existing class system and divine right of kings. What was terrifying was the claim that genetic superiority wasn't actually tied to existing social hierarchies, that the genetic modifications had been deliberately scattered across the population to prevent any single group from monopolizing them, and, most dangerously of all, that these dormant capabilities could be awakened through knowledge and technique rather than remaining the exclusive providence of those born into power.
Imagine you're a medieval king or bishop, and you discover that your authority isn't based on divine selection or inherent superiority, but on your family's genetic good fortune in carrying and occasionally activating
ancient modifications. Troubling, but manageable. You can claim divine right just as easily. But then you discover that the peasants working your fields might carry the same genetic potential, and the only thing preventing them from accessing the same enhanced capabilities is lack of knowledge about how to activate it. Suddenly, your entire power structure is revealed as nothing but information control. The moment that knowledge spreads, your advantages evaporate. This is why the controller faction, the power elite who understood the genetic basis of their authority, worked so systematically to suppress this information. It wasn't about preventing people from becoming physically stronger or living longer, though the Codex apparently contained medical knowledge for both. It was about preventing them from understanding that human inequality was artificial, maintained through deliberate suppression of knowledge about genetic activation rather than through inherent unchangeable differences. The Templars, by rediscovering and spreading this knowledge, were committing the ultimate revolutionary act, demonstrating that power based on genetic advantage could be challenged and equalized through the dissemination of techniques for awakening dormant potential. Every successful activation was proof that the controller's monopoly could be broken. But the bloodline connection had another crucial aspect: genetic memory. The Codex allegedly described a mechanism by which information could be encoded directly into DNA and passed to descendants. Not learned knowledge, actual experiential memory preserved at the genetic level, accessible under the right conditions. This sounds impossible, but recent scientific research has discovered epigenetic mechanisms by which experiences can leave markers on DNA that get inherited, and experiments have shown that trauma responses can be passed across generations in ways that look suspiciously like inherited memory. The Codex supposedly went far beyond what modern epigenetics has discovered, describing intentional encoding of complex information, mathematical formulas, technical knowledge, even sensory experiences into genetic material. The ancient civilization that created the hybrid bloodlines had developed this capability, using it to preserve crucial knowledge in a form that couldn't be destroyed by burning libraries or toppling empires. As long as the bloodline persisted, the knowledge persisted, waiting in dormant form for individuals who learned the techniques to access it. This is what Templars meant when they spoke of awakening to genetic memories. They weren't channeling spirits or receiving divine revelation. They were accessing information that had been chemically encoded into their DNA by ancestors who lived thousands of years ago. The meditation techniques, the specific tones and frequencies, the protocols for using the Codex, all of it was designed to trigger the expression of genes that had been deliberately switched off, revealing knowledge that had been literally waiting in their cells. Different bloodlines carried different types of encoded knowledge. Some lines preserved mathematical and engineering information. Others carried medical knowledge, agricultural techniques, astronomical observations, even historical accounts of the ancient world before the catastrophe that destroyed it. The Templars who accessed their genetic memories didn't all receive the same information. What they accessed depended on which bloodline they belonged to and what knowledge their specific ancestors had been tasked with preserving. This diversity of preserved knowledge is why the Templars suddenly displayed expertise in such varied fields. It wasn't that they were universally brilliant, it was that they had awakened a network of individuals carrying different pieces of the scattered ancient knowledge, and by bringing these pieces together, they could reconstruct capabilities that had been deliberately fragmented to prevent any single group from accessing complete knowledge. The Council of 13, the inner circle that legends speak of, represented this principle. 13 different bloodlines, each carrying different genetic memories, brought together to access and integrate the complete knowledge system. No single individual possessed everything. Only through cooperation could the full picture emerge. This was apparently intentional design by the ancient civilization, make the knowledge powerful enough to be worth preserving, but fragmented enough that it could only be fully accessed by a collaborative network rather than a single tyrant. The genetic activation process wasn't instant or easy. The Codex described it as occurring in stages across months or even years. Initial activation might produce enhanced pattern recognition and learning speed. Intermediate stages brought access to specific skill sets encoded in genetic memory. Advanced stages could produce capabilities that seemed almost supernatural: enhanced perception, ability to sense bioelectric fields in other humans, allowing identification of fellow carriers, even influences over their own physiology that looked like miraculous healing but were actually conscious direction of biological processes. The danger was pushing activation too fast. The human nervous system wasn't naturally adapted to handle sudden floods of ancestral memory or rapid capability expansion. Without proper pacing and integration time, activation could cause psychological breakdown. This is why the Templar training system was so gradual and systematic. They were literally reprogramming human neurology, activating dormant genetic potential, a process that had to be managed carefully to avoid damaging the very consciousness they were trying to enhance. The truly revolutionary implication was that this activation could be passed on. Once a carrier successfully awakened their genetic potential, their children would inherit not just the dormant sequences, but the activation markers, making the process easier for the next generation. Over time, with enough carriers successfully activated and passing the trait to their descendants, the modifications could spread through the population, gradually uplifting humanity as a whole rather than remaining limited to a select few. This was the Guardian faction's goal: controlled, gradual dissemination of activation knowledge, allowing more and more humans to access their latent potential until the genetic advantages became universal rather than exclusive. The Controller faction fought this because it would eliminate their basis for power. And the Templars, by rediscovering and spreading this knowledge, had reignited an ancient conflict that threatened to reshape human civilization itself. The question that haunted medieval Christendom and still haunts us today: is it true? Do some humans really carry dormant genetic modifications from an ancient civilization? Can knowledge actually be encoded in DNA and passed across generations? And if it's real, who among us might be carriers, walking through life unaware that we possess capabilities waiting to be awakened if only we knew how?
Understanding why the Catholic Church responded to the Codex Sanguinis with such extreme brutality requires going beyond simple religious rivalry or doctrinal disputes. The threat the book posed was existential. It challenged the very foundations upon which the Church's authority rested. This wasn't about competing interpretations of Scripture. It was about the complete dismantling of the narrative that justified ecclesiastical power over medieval society. Let's start with the most obvious threat. The Codex's account of human origins directly contradicted Genesis. The Church taught that humanity was created by God in His image, fallen through original sin, and in need of salvation through the Church's sacraments. This narrative established the Church as the necessary mediator between sinful humanity and divine grace. Without the Church, there was no salvation. But the Codex told a radically different story. Humans weren't fallen angels or creatures inherently corrupted by sin. They were the result of deliberate genetic engineering by an advanced civilization, possibly even multiple civilizations over extended time periods. Human capabilities weren't limited by divine decree, but dormant genetic potential waiting to be activated. Sin wasn't moral failure, but ignorance of one's true nature. And salvation wasn't something granted by external authority, but an internal transformation accessible through knowledge and technique. Do you see the problem? If the Codex was right, the entire theological framework justifying the Church's existence collapsed. People didn't need priests to intercede with God. They needed teachers to help them access their latent capabilities. They didn't need sacraments to wash away original sin. They needed techniques to activate dormant genetic sequences. The Church wasn't humanity's savior. It was, at best, irrelevant, and at worst, an impediment deliberately suppressing knowledge of human potential to maintain its own power. But the theological challenge went deeper.
According to Templar testimony about the Codex's contents, Jesus wasn't unique. He was one of many individuals across history who had successfully activated the full potential of the genetic modifications. He wasn't the only begotten Son of God. He was an exceptionally successful exemplar of what awakened humans could become. His miracles weren't supernatural interventions, but natural expressions of fully activated genetic capabilities. Healing through conscious direction of biological processes, reading minds through enhanced perception of bioelectric fields, even the resurrection interpreted as mastery over cellular regeneration. This interpretation didn't deny Jesus' significance. In some ways, it elevated it by suggesting his achievements were real demonstrations of human potential rather than one-time divine interventions that could never be repeated. But it completely demolished the Church's exclusive claim to represent Christ's authority. If Jesus was teaching a method for human transformation rather than founding an institution to mediate salvation, then the Church as it existed in the medieval period was actually a perversion of his message rather than its fulfillment. The Codex apparently went even further, suggesting that the early Christian Church had been deliberately altered by controller faction infiltrators who recognized that Jesus' actual teachings about internal transformation and the divine potential within humans were too dangerous to ruling elites. They couldn't suppress Christianity entirely, it was spreading too rapidly, so they co-opted it, gradually shifting emphasis from Jesus' teachings about human awakening to doctrines about institutional authority, priestly mediation, and submission to ecclesiastical power. According to this narrative, by the time the Catholic Church became the official religion of the Roman Empire, it bore little resemblance to what Jesus had actually taught. The original message that humans possessed latent divine capabilities that could be awakened through practice had been systematically edited out, replaced with doctrines emphasizing human unworthiness, the need for external salvation, and, most importantly, the Church's exclusive authority to provide that salvation. Think about what this meant for a medieval bishop or pope who encountered this information. If it was true, they weren't just wrong in their interpretation of Scripture. They were unknowing puppets in an ancient deception, spending their lives enforcing a theological system specifically designed to prevent humans from discovering their true potential. Their entire life's work, everything they believed about their holy mission, was revealed as part of a control mechanism stretching back centuries. Worse, many church leaders carried the bloodline themselves. The genetic modifications had been deliberately scattered across all social classes, meaning noble families, the very families that produced bishops and cardinals, were actually more likely than average to be carriers. Church officials might themselves possess dormant capabilities that they had spent their lives suppressing in others, capabilities that challenged everything their theology taught about human nature and divine grace. This created an impossible psychological position. Accept the Codex's claims, and you invalidate your entire worldview, your life's purpose, your understanding of reality. Reject it, and you must destroy it so completely that no one else ever gets the chance to be convinced by it. There's no middle ground, no comfortable compromise. The Codex demanded a choice, evolution or extinction of your belief system. The practical threats were equally severe. The Church's power in medieval society wasn't purely spiritual, it was political and economic. The Church owned vast territories, collected tithes from across Christendom, commanded loyalty that transcended national boundaries. All of this was justified by its claim to spiritual authority. If that authority was revealed as illegitimate, based on suppressed knowledge rather than divine appointment, the entire political and economic structure collapsed.
Imagine peasants who learned that the Church was deliberately keeping them ignorant of techniques that could enhance their intelligence, health, and capabilities. Imagine nobles who discovered that their authority wasn't divine right, but genetic lottery. and that the genes they'd won could be activated in commoners as well. Imagine kings who realized that bishops guiding their policies were potentially controller faction agents, using religion as a tool to prevent human advancement. The Codex didn't just challenge religious authority, it exposed the mechanisms by which that authority was maintained and revealed those mechanisms as deliberate suppression of knowledge. This made everyone who understood the book's contents into a walking threat to established order. They couldn't be reasoned with or bought off because they had accessed information that made compromise impossible. They had to be eliminated. The Church's response revealed how seriously they took the threat. The persecution of the Templars wasn't a typical heresy suppression. It was total war, coordinated simultaneously across multiple kingdoms, conducted with extraordinary brutality, and designed not just to punish, but to utterly destroy. Templars were tortured extensively to reveal the location of the Codex. When they wouldn't talk, their families were threatened. When that didn't work, their interrogators used techniques that were extreme even by medieval Inquisition standards. The desperation shows in the trial records. Inquisitors asked specific questions about the book written on metal and the texts that glow with inner light. They demanded to know where it was hidden, who else had read it, what copies existed. The intensity of focus on finding and destroying the Codex exceeded even the attention paid to confiscating Templar gold. This wasn't about money or power in the conventional sense. It was about information control. And here's what reveals the depth of the Church's fear. After the Templar persecution, institutional policies changed dramatically. The Inquisition expanded its mandate specifically to hunt for forbidden texts, with particular emphasis on books claiming to contain pre-Christian knowledge. Monasteries were ordered to conduct inventories of their libraries, surrendering any text that couldn't be verified as Orthodox Christian writings. Universities were required to submit curricula for approval, ensuring no forbidden knowledge was being transmitted through educational channels. Even the architecture of churches changed. New construction emphasized specific design principles that, according to some researchers, deliberately avoided the geometric relationships and proportions that Templar structures had incorporated, proportions allegedly specified in the Codex as conducive to consciousness expansion and genetic awakening. It's as if the Church was trying to create physical environments that would actually inhibit activation rather than enhance it. The suppression extended beyond texts to bloodlines themselves. Genealogical records, which the Templars had apparently been compiling to identify carriers, became subject to Church oversight. Noble families known to have intermarried with Templar bloodlines found themselves under increased scrutiny. There are even suggestions that arranged marriages were encouraged or discouraged based on whether they would dilute or concentrate genetic markers associated with the ancient modifications. This multi-pronged approach, destroying texts, persecuting carriers, altering architecture, controlling marriages, reveals a systematic effort not just to suppress a book, but to eliminate the genetic and mimetic legacy it represented. The Church was trying to erase not just information, but the very biological capacity to access and utilize that information. But could they succeed? Could an organization, even one as powerful as the medieval Catholic Church, truly eliminate genetic sequences that had been scattered across the human population for thousands of years? Could they destroy all copies of knowledge that had been deliberately designed to be preserved and transmitted across generations? The evidence suggests they couldn't, and they knew it. Despite the persecution, despite the burnings and torture, despite the systematic destruction of Templar sites and records, the Church never declared victory. They never announced that the Codex had been found and destroyed. Instead, the Inquisition continued for centuries, always hunting, always interrogating, always searching for the book that had threatened to expose them. Because here's what truly terrified the Church. The Codex wasn't just a physical object. The knowledge it contained was designed to be transmissible. Once someone accessed the full awakening, they could guide others through the process, passing on techniques and understanding even without the physical book. Every fully awakened individual became a new source of the forbidden knowledge. This meant that destroying the Codex wasn't enough. The Church would have to identify and eliminate every person who had ever accessed its contents, and every person those individuals had taught. They'd have to break the chain of transmission completely, and do it secretly enough that they didn't draw attention to what they were trying to suppress, because attention itself could make people curious enough to seek the knowledge independently. It was an impossible task, which is why 7 centuries after the Templar persecution, researchers still find hints of the Codex in historical records, still encounter mysterious references to the Book of Blood in suppressed documents, still hear whispers in esoteric traditions about ancient knowledge preserved and waiting to be rediscovered. The Church feared the Codex because it couldn't be permanently destroyed. It could only be temporarily suppressed, hidden for a time, driven underground where it would wait patiently across generations until conditions allowed it to resurface. Every century that passed without finding and destroying it was another century where it might be rediscovered, where someone might access its contents and reignite the awakening process. The fear wasn't about what the book had already done. It was about what it might yet do. In the Renaissance, in the Enlightenment, in the modern age where science was beginning to discover genetic mechanisms that might validate what the Codex had claimed all along. The fear was that eventually, inevitably, humanity would become ready for the knowledge the book contained. And when that moment came, no amount of suppression would be able to contain it.
So far, we've been discussing the Codex Sanguinis based on legend, testimony, and historical accounts that critics dismiss as fantasy or torture-induced confections. But now we need to examine the actual evidence, the physical clues, historical anomalies, and documented facts that suggest the book wasn't just medieval mythology, but a real artifact that existed and perhaps still exists somewhere, hidden and waiting. Let's start with the most compelling evidence, the consistency of descriptions across independent sources. When the Templars were arrested in 1307, interrogations occurred simultaneously across France, Spain, Italy, and other regions. These knights had no way to coordinate their stories. Yet when asked about sacred objects in their possession, dozens of testimonies independently described the same thing: a book made of metal pages, bound without visible bindings, containing text that appeared to move or change and producing unusual sensations when touched. The descriptions are too specific and too consistent to be coincidental. If Templars were simply making things up under torture, you'd expect wild variation, some describing books, others relics, still others mentioning nothing of the sort. Instead, you get detailed, matching accounts from men who were interrogated hundreds of miles apart by different inquisitors using different techniques. They describe the same silvery metal, the same warm-to-touch sensation, the same phenomenon of text that adapted to the reader. Even more striking, Arab historians from the same period reference Crusader knights discovering metal tablets inscribed with ancient knowledge beneath the Temple Mount. These accounts were written independently of European sources by observers with no reason to support Templar legends and every reason to disparage Christian knights. Yet they corroborate the basic claim. Something unusual, something written on metal, was discovered in the temple foundations during the early Crusader period. Byzantine sources add another layer of confirmation. A 12th century chronicle by a Constantinople-based historian describes Templar envoys visiting the imperial library and showing extreme interest in ancient texts about the engineer kings and the blood of the ancients. The chronicler noted that these Templars seemed to be seeking information to verify or decode something they had already found, not conducting random research. They were looking for texts that could help them understand an artifact they already possessed. Then there's the archaeological evidence. Excavations beneath the Temple Mount, conducted sporadically when political conditions allow, have revealed extensive tunnel systems dating to different periods. Some of these passages show clear signs of medieval Crusader excavation. But more intriguingly, they found sealed chambers from much earlier periods, some predating even Solomon's original temple, containing empty stone shelving and clay jars with broken seals. Something was stored there, something was removed during the Templar period. The evidence of systematic excavation is undeniable. You can see where medieval tools broke through ancient sealwork, where Crusader-era supports were installed in passages that hadn't been opened for over 1,000 years. The Templars definitely were looking for something specific, and based on the extent of their excavation, they found it. The architectural evidence is equally suggestive. After 1128, the year the Templars returned from their initial Jerusalem excavation, their building practices changed dramatically. Suddenly, they were incorporating mathematical ratios in their constructions that wouldn't be rediscovered by European mathematics for another 2 centuries. The golden ratio, Fibonacci sequences, specific geometric relationships that produce unusual acoustic properties. All of this shows up in Templar architecture after Jerusalem, but not before. Where did this knowledge come from? The official history offers no explanation. But if you accept that they discovered texts containing advanced mathematical and architectural principles, the sudden appearance of these techniques makes perfect sense. They weren't developing new knowledge through conventional learning. They were applying preserved ancient knowledge to medieval construction. Look at Rosslyn Chapel in Scotland, built by known Templar-connected families long after the Order's official destruction. The building incorporates mathematical precision and symbolic encoding that scholars still don't fully understand. Carvings of plants from the Americas appear throughout, plants that Europeans allegedly didn't encounter until Columbus, decades after the chapel was built. How did the builders know what New World corn and aloe looked like? Possibly because they were working from descriptions in ancient texts that documented global exploration by previous civilizations. Then there are the trial documents themselves, which contain details that prosecutors would never have invented. Inquisitors questioning Templars asked about specific passages from the Codex, quoting fragments of text that describe genetic inheritance and bloodline markers. These aren't concepts that 14th century churchmen would naturally think to ask about. Where did they get these details? The only logical answer? From Templars who actually describe the book's contents, forcing inquisitors to incorporate this strange information into their questioning of other knights. Some trial transcripts include sketches, crude drawings made by interrogators trying to document what Templars described. These show geometric symbols, diagrams of what look like architectural plans or possibly circuit diagrams, and most intriguingly, a rough sketch labeled "The Metal Pages That Glow." The artist clearly didn't understand what they were drawing. The symbols are copied incorrectly, the proportions are wrong, but the attempt to document something unusual and unprecedented is there in the official records. Vatican archives, what little has been made accessible to researchers, contain multiple references to the Templar book or the Forbidden Text in documents from the 14th through 17th centuries. Popes issued bulls ordering continued searches for it. Cardinals wrote letters debating whether it had been destroyed or merely hidden. As late as 1650, there's a record of Inquisition agents investigating a report that the metal book of the warrior monks had been seen in a monastery in Bavaria. The investigation concluded the report was mistaken, but the fact that such investigations continued for 3 centuries after the Templar persecution suggests the Church never believed the book had been destroyed. Modern researchers have identified what they call codex echoes, fragmentary texts that appear to quote or paraphrase passages from the book. These show up in unexpected places. A margin note in a 15th century medical text describing inherited memories in blood. An architectural treatise from 1480 that references proportions that wake the sleeping builders. An early Renaissance philosophy manuscript that discusses the ancient engineers who improved human clay. None of these sources claim to have seen the codex directly, but they all seem to be referencing shared source material that matches the book's alleged contents. It's as if knowledge from the Codex leaked out in fragments, spreading through esoteric networks, even though the book itself remained hidden. This pattern continues into modern times, with references appearing in Masonic literature, Rosicrucian documents, and other esoteric traditions. Always fragmentary, always attributed to ancient sources, always describing concepts that align with what the Codex supposedly contained. Perhaps the most intriguing modern evidence comes from metallurgical analysis. In the 1960s, researchers at the British Museum examined a small fragment of unknown metal that had been in their collection since the Victorian era, catalogued only as medieval religious artifact. Analysis revealed an alloy that didn't match any known medieval metalworking techniques. The metal was primarily silver titanium, a combination that requires processing techniques far beyond medieval capability. Titanium wasn't even isolated as a pure element until 1825. The fragment was thin, flexible despite its metallic composition, and showed faint etching on one surface that microscopic analysis revealed as text in multiple scripts. Before further testing could be completed, the fragment was requisitioned by another institution and promptly disappeared from the research record. But the initial analysis report remains, a piece of metal that shouldn't exist in a medieval context, with properties matching Templar descriptions of the Codex pages, carrying multilingual text that appeared to have been etched at a microscopic scale. This brings us to the most compelling category of evidence: the continuing disappearances and deaths of people who claim to have found or seen the Codex. This isn't ancient history, it's ongoing. In 1891, a French antiquarian named Henri Boudet claimed to have discovered the true Templar treasure and died mysteriously before publishing his findings, his research papers confiscated by unknown parties. In 1943, Nazi occult researchers reportedly found Templar documents in southern France referring to the Codex's location. These researchers vanished along with their findings during the chaos of war's end. In 1972, a British historian researching Templar archives in Malta discovered references to the Book of the Bloodline being moved to Scotland in 1307. He died of a sudden heart attack at age 43 with no previous cardiac history, the day before he was scheduled to present his findings. His research notes disappeared from his office before his family could retrieve them. In 1998, a Spanish archaeologist investigating Templar sites announced he had found evidence of a hidden chamber that might contain the legendary metal book. He was killed in a car accident 2 weeks later. The accident report noted his brakes had mysteriously failed despite a recent safety inspection. These patterns of discovery, announcement, and sudden death or disappearance occur too frequently to be coincidental. Someone, some organization or network, is actively monitoring for Codex-related discoveries and acting to suppress them. The most common explanation in researcher circles is that secret societies descended from either the Templar or anti-Templar factions are still operating, still engaged in the ancient conflict over this knowledge. One side trying to protect the book, the other trying to find and destroy it. The final piece of evidence is the most subtle but perhaps most revealing: the things we don't find. In 7 centuries of intensive archaeological work across Europe and the Middle East, countless Templar sites have been excavated. We've found coins, weapons, architecture, art, documents. But we've never found their most important records. The Templar archives, the complete documentation of their discoveries, operations, and knowledge, simply don't exist in any captured collection. That's not because they didn't keep records. Medieval organizations were obsessive record keepers, and the Templars ran a complex international operation that would have required extensive documentation. Where are the archives? The most logical answer? Successfully evacuated and hidden along with the Codex itself. The absence of evidence is itself evidence, evidence of successful concealment that has lasted 700 years. So when we weigh all the evidence,
The consistent testimonies, the archaeological findings, the sudden knowledge innovations, the continuing suppression efforts, the metallurgical anomalies, and the suspicious absence of records, what conclusion is most reasonable? That every source was mistaken or lying? Every innovation was coincidental? Every death and disappearance was random chance? And the Church spent centuries hunting for something that never existed? Or that the Codex Sanguinis was real, that it contained knowledge dangerous enough to justify extraordinary suppression efforts, and that it remains hidden somewhere, protected by descendants of those who understood its value? The evidence doesn't prove the Codex exists beyond doubt, but it certainly suggests that something unusual was discovered, something valuable enough that organizations have been willing to kill for it and die for it across 7 centuries. Whether that something matches the legendary descriptions exactly, we can't know for certain, but the pattern is clear. The Codex was, and possibly still is, real.
If the Codex Sanguinis survived the Templar persecution, and evidence suggests it did, then where is it now? For 7 centuries, treasure hunters, scholars, and secret societies have pursued this question. The search has produced numerous theories, each pointing to different locations based on historical clues, architectural evidence, and coded messages allegedly left by fleeing Templars. Let's examine the most credible possibilities and the evidence supporting each. The first and perhaps most famous candidate is Roslin Chapel in Scotland. Built between 1446 and 1484 by William Sinclair, whose family had extensive Templar connections, the chapel has long been associated with hidden Templar treasures. The building itself is an elaborate puzzle, covered in symbolic carvings that researchers have spent centuries trying to decode. Mathematical analysis of the chapel's architecture reveals encoded musical frequencies, astronomical alignments, and geometric relationships that shouldn't appear in medieval construction. Most intriguingly, Roslin contains sealed chambers beneath the main structure that have never been officially opened. Ground-penetrating radar has confirmed the existence of these vaults, and they appear to be deliberately constructed rather than natural formations. The Sinclair family has consistently refused permission for excavation, citing structural concerns. But some researchers suggest the real reason is that the family knows what's down there and has been protecting it for centuries, perhaps fulfilling an oath made to Templar refugees who brought the Codex to Scotland in 1307. The timing supports this theory. Historical records show that Templar ships departed from La Rochelle, France, just before the mass arrests. These ships were never accounted for by French authorities. Scottish records from the same period mention the arrival of warrior monks seeking sanctuary, arriving with sacred treasures that were received by noble families with Templar sympathies. If you were evacuating the Codex from France, Scotland in 1307 was the logical destination. Far from papal authority, ruled by Robert the Bruce, who had been excommunicated and thus had no reason to cooperate with the Church, and connected to the Templars through existing networks. The second major possibility is Oak Island in Nova Scotia, Canada. This location seems absurd. Why would medieval knights transport a treasure across the Atlantic decades before Columbus? But there's surprising evidence suggesting pre-Columbian European presence in North America. The Oak Island Money Pit, discovered in 1795, shows engineering sophistication that seems beyond colonial-era construction. The shaft includes multiple levels of wooden platforms, clay barriers, and most remarkably, a flood tunnel system designed to fill the pit with seawater if excavators dig too deep without knowing the correct approach. Who would construct such an elaborate protective system, and for what? Over 200 years of excavation attempts have recovered tantalizing fragments, pieces of parchment, coconut fiber, not native to Nova Scotia, metal fragments tested as pre-colonial in date, and most intriguingly, a stone inscribed with symbols that some researchers claim match Templar encryption systems.
Recent analysis suggests the stone's inscription might contain coordinates or directions to a deeper chamber that hasn't been yet located. The Oak Island theory posits that Templars who escaped France in 1307 didn't just flee to Scotland. Some continued westward, following ancient sailing routes that the Codex itself might have described. Remember, the book allegedly contained knowledge from a previous advanced civilization. If that civilization had reached global navigation, the Codex might have included maps showing lands across the Atlantic. Templars following these directions could have reached North America, creating an ultimate hiding place beyond the reach of any European power. A third possibility focuses on southern France, specifically the region around Rennes-le-Château. This area was Templar territory and contains numerous sites connected to the order. In the 1890s, a local priest named Bérenger Saunière suddenly became rich after discovering something during church renovations, something that gave him leverage over Vatican officials and allowed him to live in unexplained luxury. Before his death, he claimed that he had found a secret that would shake the church to its foundations. What did Saunière discover? Some researchers believe he found documents pointing to the Codex's location, possibly even accessing the book itself. The region contains a complex network of caves and underground chambers, many showing signs of deliberate modification. Certain locations display the same geometric relationships and astronomical alignments found in Templar architecture. It's possible the Codex was never evacuated from France at all, but was hidden in nearby caves, protected by a network of local families who had Templar connections. The landscape itself contains clues. Several hills and mountains in the region have names referencing treasure, gold, or books. Church buildings show unusual architectural features, including one with a pillar that's hollow and contains a cavity large enough for a book-sized object. Saunière made extensive renovations to his church, but some researchers believe he was actually encoding the Codex's location into the new architecture, creating a permanent record that wouldn't be lost even if written directions were destroyed. A fourth theory points to Portugal, where Templars weren't persecuted but were simply renamed as the Order of Christ. King Dinas of Portugal protected the Templars, allowing them to continue their operations under a new name. If the Codex was successfully evacuated from France, Portugal offered a legitimate sanctuary where it could be openly protected by a state institution. The Order of Christ went on to sponsor Portuguese exploration, including Vasco da Gama's voyage to India and many expeditions to Africa and the Americas.
Why would the Order of Christ suddenly become so interested in exploration and navigation? Perhaps because they possessed ancient maps and sailing directions contained in the Codex. The Order's symbol, a red cross with white edges, was essentially the Templar cross with colors reversed, appearing on the sails of every Portuguese exploration vessel. These ships were literally sailing under Templar emblems, possibly following routes described in ancient texts that had been preserved by fleeing knights. Tomar, Portugal, where the Order of Christ was headquartered, contains architecture remarkably similar to Templar structures in Jerusalem. The castle includes sealed chambers, unexplored underground passages, and buildings designed with the same geometric precision found in confirmed Templar sites. If you were going to hide the Codex in plain sight, protected by a legitimate religious military order operating with royal sanction, Tomar would be the perfect location. A fifth possibility is the Vatican itself, the ultimate ironic hiding place. This theory suggests that the Church did find the Codex during the Templar persecution, but chose to hide it rather than destroy it. Why? Because those who actually read it became convinced of its authenticity and importance. Instead of destroying knowledge that might be valuable, they chose to secure it in the deepest levels of the Vatican secret archives, accessible only to the highest church officials, preserved but never revealed. This would explain the Vatican's continuing interest in Codex-related discoveries. They're not searching for a book they failed to find. They're monitoring to ensure nobody else finds evidence pointing toward what they already possess. The Vatican archives contain an estimated 35 million pages of documents, most never cataloged or examined by outside researchers. Deep within those collections, in sections never opened to scholars, the Codex could be sitting on a shelf, its explosive contents known to only a handful of cardinals across generations. Supporting this theory, the Vatican has demonstrated remarkable knowledge of specific Codex contents in various documents, quoting passages that shouldn't exist if the book was never found. Where did these quotations come from? The simplest explanation is that Vatican officials have access to the book itself, using it as a reference while publicly claiming it never existed or was destroyed. A sixth theory proposes that the Codex isn't in a single location at all. Instead, facing the certainty of persecution, the Templars might have separated the book's metal pages, distributing them across multiple hiding places. This would make the book nearly impossible to find completely. You'd need to locate numerous separate caches, each hidden in different countries, each protected by different networks. But it would also ensure that even if some pages were discovered and destroyed, others would survive. This theory explains why Codex references appear in diverse locations across Europe and beyond. Different groups found different pages, accessing fragments of the complete knowledge. The geometric principles appear in Scottish architecture. The navigation information influences Portuguese exploration. The genetic theories leak into Rosicrucian texts. The historical accounts inform Masonic traditions, each group possessing pieces of a larger whole that none fully comprehend. If this theory is correct, the Codex could only be reassembled by an organization with global reach and centuries of patience, exactly the kind of network the Templars allegedly created before their public destruction. Perhaps the goal was never to keep the book in one piece, but to scatter it so thoroughly that it could only be reconstructed when humanity reached a level of development where the knowledge could be safely revealed and properly understood. The final, most disturbing possibility, the Codex is in private hands, owned by a collector or secret society that has no intention of ever revealing it. Throughout history, wealthy individuals have acquired controversial artifacts, hiding them in private collections to avoid legal complications or unwanted attention. The Codex, if it appeared on the black market, would be the ultimate acquisition for someone interested in esoteric knowledge, and the ultimate secret to keep, because public revelation would bring immediate attention from multiple organizations determined to seize or destroy it. This scenario is depressingly plausible. The artifact market operates largely in the shadow, with major discoveries often disappearing into private vaults never to be seen again. A seller offering a metal book with unusual properties, said to be of Templar origin, would find buyers willing to pay enormous sums with no questions asked and complete confidentiality guaranteed. Once in private hands, the Codex could sit in a climate-controlled vault somewhere, examined occasionally by its owner and a handful of trusted associates, its existence unknown to the wider world. Each theory has supporting evidence, and none can be definitively ruled out. The truth might involve elements of multiple scenarios. Perhaps the Codex was separated, with some pages reaching Scotland, others Portugal, some ending up in Vatican vaults, and a few in private collections. Or perhaps it's not in any of these locations, hidden somewhere we haven't even imagined, waiting for someone to decode clues that have been sitting in plain sight for centuries. What's certain is this: if the Codex exists, someone knows where it is. Whether that someone is a family that has protected it across generations, a secret society that continues Templar traditions, or a Vatican cardinal with access to the deepest archives, the knowledge hasn't been completely lost. It's only been hidden, waiting for a time when revelation serves the purposes of those who control it, or when someone clever and persistent enough finally solves a 7-century-old puzzle and brings the book's secrets back into the light. The search continues. Every year, new clues emerge, new excavations are attempted, new theories are proposed. And every year, the mystery deepens, because the more we learn about the Templars and their era, the more plausible the Codex legend becomes. We're not chasing a myth. We're chasing something real that powerful forces have worked very hard to keep hidden. And that makes it all the more certain that it's worth finding.
Imagine the announcement appears tomorrow. The Codex Sanguinis has been found. A team of archaeologists working at one of the locations we discussed breaks through a sealed chamber, and there it is. Metal pages, glowing text, exactly as the legends described. What happens next? The answer reveals why this artifact remains so dangerous that organizations might still be willing to kill to control or destroy it. The immediate reaction would be unprecedented chaos in the academic world. If the book is genuine, if it's truly constructed from materials and using techniques that predate any known civilization, it would overturn fundamental assumptions about human history. We'd have physical proof that an advanced civilization existed before the earliest known cultures, possessing metallurgy, writing systems, and possibly technologies that we're still developing today. Every archaeology textbook would need revision. The entire timeline of human development, the gradual progression from hunter-gatherers to agricultural societies to early civilizations, would be revealed as incomplete at best, fundamentally wrong at worst. We'd have to accept that human history includes a forgotten chapter, an advanced culture that rose and fell, leaving only scattered traces and hidden knowledge. But the academic disruption would be nothing compared to the religious and philosophical earthquake. If the Codex's account of human origins is verified, if it demonstrates that humans were genetically modified by a previous civilization, then every religion's creation story becomes, at best, allegorical. The implications for Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and other faiths would be profound and destabilizing. Consider the Vatican's position. The Catholic Church has spent 2 millennia building theology on specific claims about human nature, original sin, and the need for salvation through Christ. If the Codex proves that humans weren't created by God in their current form, but were engineered by an earlier civilization, that theological foundation cracks. The Church would face an impossible choice: either accept the evidence and undergo revolutionary theological revision, or reject the evidence and appear to be denying scientific fact, precisely the position they've tried to avoid since the Galileo incident. Protestant denominations would face similar challenges, though without centralized authority, their responses would be more varied and chaotic. Some would adapt quickly, reinterpreting Scripture in light of the new evidence. Others would reject the Codex as demonic deception, creating a massive schism within Christianity between those who accept and those who deny the physical evidence. Islam would confront parallel difficulties. The Quran's account of human creation would need reinterpretation. But Islamic tradition includes references to jinn, beings created before humans with knowledge and capabilities beyond human norms. Some Islamic scholars might find ways to integrate Codex revelations into existing theology, interpreting the ancient genetic engineers as jinn or their works. Others would reject any deviation from traditional interpretation, potentially triggering conflicts between modernist and traditionalist Muslim communities. The political implications would be equally explosive. If the Codex contains evidence that certain bloodlines carry genetic modifications conferring enhanced capabilities, we'd face immediate controversy over genetic testing, discrimination, and human rights. Should we test populations to identify carriers? Would enhanced individuals deserve special status or face discrimination? Would nations begin genetic screening programs seeking to identify and recruit bloodline carriers? Think about the military applications. If the awakening techniques described in the Codex actually work, if they can trigger dormant genetic sequences enhancing intelligence, perception, and cognitive processing, every military and intelligence agency would seek to exploit them.
We'd see a new arms race, not for weapons, but for human enhancement protocols based on ancient knowledge. Special forces would undergo awakening training, intelligence analysts would receive genetic screening, the geopolitical balance would shift toward nations successfully implementing these programs. The economic disruption would be profound. If the Codex contains preserved ancient knowledge, engineering principles, mathematical insights, medical techniques, it would represent the greatest information windfall in history. Patents worth trillions of dollars could be filed based on Codex contents. Nations and corporations would fight for access and control. We might see technology leaps that normally take decades compressed into years as ancient innovations are reverse engineered and implemented. But here's where it gets truly dangerous. The Codex allegedly describes not just individual enhancement, but the ancient conflict between guardian and controller factions. If that conflict is real, if there are actually organized networks descended from these factions still operating today, then revealing the Codex would bring that shadow war into the open. Imagine discovering that many world leaders, corporate executives, and influential figures across history have been unknowing participants in this ancient conflict. That major historical events, wars, political movements, scientific breakthroughs were influenced or directed by factions pursuing agendas stretching back thousands of years. The conspiracy theories that people dismiss today as paranoid fantasy would be revealed as understated descriptions of reality. The social disruption could be catastrophic. People would question whether they're living authentic lives or following programming encoded by ancient factions. Trust in institutions would collapse as people wondered which organizations were infiltrated by controller faction representatives. Political polarization, already extreme, would intensify as different groups interpreted Codex revelations to support their existing ideologies.
Some would see the genetic modifications as humanity's rightful inheritance, something to be awakened in everyone. They'd advocate for mandatory testing, universal access to awakening protocols, a forced evolution of the entire species whether individuals want it or not. Others would see the modifications as corruption of natural humanity, something to be eliminated through genetic editing or, at minimum, prevented from spreading further. We'd face fundamental questions about human identity. What does it mean to be human? Do the unmodified and modified represent different species? Should they have equal rights? The security implications are staggering. If the Codex reveals the locations of other hidden repositories containing ancient knowledge and technologies, we'd see a global rush to secure these sites. Nations would claim sites within their borders as sovereign resources. Archaeological sites would become military objectives. We might witness actual warfare over access to ancient caches, with countries justifying invasions as necessary to prevent dangerous knowledge from falling into enemy hands. International organizations would face impossible regulatory challenges. How do you govern access to knowledge that can enhance human capabilities? Do you treat awakening techniques as controlled substances, requiring licensing and oversight? How do you prevent black markets in genetic enhancement? What do you do about nations that refuse to abide by international agreements and implement awakening programs unilaterally? The legal system would collapse into chaos. If some individuals demonstrably possess enhanced cognitive capabilities due to activated genetic modifications, how do you ensure fair trials when juries might include both enhanced and baseline humans? Do enhanced individuals face stricter standards of responsibility since they have superior capabilities? Can enhanced mental perception be admitted as evidence? The entire framework of legal equality collapses when people aren't actually equal in cognitive capacity. Education systems would face revolutionary pressure. If awakening can enhance learning ability and intelligence, parents would demand access to protocols for their children. Private schools offering awakening training would emerge, creating a new form of inequality more profound than anything based on wealth alone. Nations would face decisions about whether to make enhancement mandatory in public education,
And what to do about parents who refuse on religious or philosophical grounds? The medical and insurance industries would be transformed overnight. If the Codex contains ancient medical knowledge, we might see cures for diseases that currently kill millions. But this would create immediate controversies over access and cost. Should life-saving knowledge from the Codex be freely available or controlled by pharmaceutical companies? How do you price medicine based on ancient formulas that no one invented? Insurance companies would struggle to assess risk when some clients have access to enhancement technologies that extend lifespans and improve health in ways baseline humans cannot match. Perhaps most disturbing, we'd discover whether the surveillance and control systems being built by modern governments are actually influenced by controller faction descendants continuing their ancient agenda. If the Codex's narrative about a faction seeking to maintain power through suppression of human potential is accurate, we'd have to re-examine every form of modern control, financial systems, surveillance technology, social media algorithms, asking whether these are tools of convenience or components of an ancient strategy for managing and limiting human development. The mental health consequences would be severe. Millions of people would experience existential crises as their understanding of reality and human nature fundamentally shifted. We'd see massive increases in anxiety, depression, and psychological breakdown as people struggled to integrate revelations that challenge everything they believed about themselves and their place in the world. Suicide rates would likely spike among those unable to cope with the collapse of their worldview. Religious violence would almost certainly increase. Fundamentalist groups viewing the Codex as ultimate heresy or demonic deception would likely target researchers, institutions, and individuals associated with its study. We might see terrorism justified as defending humanity from corruption, with attacks on genetic research facilities, universities studying the Codex, and even individuals who undergo awakening protocols. And here's the darkest possibility. If the Codex is found and verified, and if controller faction networks are real and still active, we might see them move openly for the first time in millennia. Organizations that have operated in shadow for thousands of years might decide that secrecy is no longer viable, that they must act directly to suppress or spin the Codex revelations before they destabilize the control systems those organizations have spent centuries building. This could manifest as coordinated global action, simultaneous moves by governments, corporations, media organizations, and other institutions to contain, discredit, or co-opt the Codex discovery. We might see the artifact seized by authorities, researchers silenced through legal or extra-legal means, information suppressed through unprecedented censorship, and a coordinated campaign to convince the public that the Codex is either a hoax or irrelevant to modern life. Or it could be more subtle. Allow the Codex to be studied and discussed, but control the narrative around it. Ensure that interpretations that threaten existing power structures are marginalized, while versions that support the status quo are amplified. Turn the Codex into entertainment, movies, books, games that encode its revelations as fiction so people dismiss the reality even as they consume the stories. Make the truth so widely available that it becomes invisible, hidden in plain sight because everyone assumes it's just another fantasy rather than documented fact. This is why the Codex remains hidden, or if it's been found, why discovery hasn't been announced. The artifact is too dangerous, too disruptive, too threatening to too many powerful interests to be casually revealed. Whether it's secret societies protecting ancient knowledge, governments guarding potential military advantages, religious institutions preventing theological chaos, or private collectors avoiding complications, every current possessor has overwhelming incentive to maintain secrecy. The question isn't really what would happen if the Codex was found. The question is, what would it take for anyone who found it to actually reveal that discovery to the world? What circumstances would make the risk of revelation worthwhile despite the certainty of chaos, conflict, and danger that would immediately follow? Perhaps only a world that was already in crisis, already questioning its fundamental assumptions, already teetering on the edge of transformation. A world where the disruption caused by the Codex couldn't make things much worse and might actually provide answers humanity desperately needed. A world, perhaps, very much like the one we're living in right now. Which raises one final unsettling thought. What if the Codex has been found, and we're currently living through the carefully managed revelation of its contents, with knowledge being released gradually, encoded in scientific discoveries and cultural shifts, preparing humanity for the moment when the full truth can finally be revealed? What if the awakening has already begun?
We've examined what the Codex allegedly contains, why it was hidden, where it might be, and what would happen if it was found. But there's one more possibility we need to consider, one that's simultaneously the most disturbing and most hopeful. What if the knowledge isn't hidden at all? What if the awakening the Codex describes has already been triggered, and we're living through the early stages without recognizing it? Look at the patterns emerging in our current era. Sudden leaps in technology that seem to come from nowhere. Innovations appearing simultaneously in multiple locations as if people are tapping into shared knowledge sources. Children displaying cognitive abilities that previous generations didn't possess at comparable ages. A growing sense among populations worldwide that something fundamental is shifting, that we're approaching a threshold of transformation that nobody can quite articulate, but everyone somehow feels. What if these aren't random developments? What if they're symptoms of genetic activation occurring across the population? The modifications described in the Codex beginning to express themselves spontaneously as humanity reaches a critical mass of development that triggers the awakening protocols. Consider the technology curve. For most of human history, innovation proceeded slowly, incrementally, across generations. But in the past century, and especially the past few decades, the pace has become exponential. We went from first powered flight to moon landing in 66 years, from room-sized computers to smartphones in less than 50 years, from early internet to artificial intelligence that can simulate human reasoning in about 30 years. Each breakthrough accelerates the next in a pattern that looks less like natural development and more like something being unlocked, revealed, remembered from a source that's been dormant until now. The standard explanation is that each innovation builds on previous ones, creating compound acceleration. But there's another interpretation. We're accessing preserved knowledge, either directly through awakened individuals who carry genetic memories, or indirectly through inspiration and insight that flows from activated genetic sequences influencing human consciousness in ways we don't yet understand. Look at the people driving these innovations. Many of history's greatest inventors and scientists reported their breakthroughs came through dreams, sudden insights, or moments of inexplicable knowing rather than through logical deduction. Tesla saw entire machines in visions. Einstein developed relativity through thought experiments that seemed to bypass normal reasoning. Modern innovators describe similar experiences, seeing solutions fully formed, understanding complex systems intuitively without knowing how they know. What if these aren't just exceptional individuals with unusual cognitive gifts? What if they're bloodline carriers experiencing spontaneous activation, accessing genetic memories that contain knowledge from the ancient civilization? The Codex allegedly described activation as something that could happen naturally under the right environmental conditions, not just through deliberate protocols. As humanity's technological development approaches certain thresholds,
As our environment becomes more complex and demanding of enhanced cognitive processing, the dormant genetic modifications might begin activating spontaneously in carriers across the population. This would explain another modern phenomenon: the increasing number of children being diagnosed with what we call disorders, ADHD, autism spectrum conditions, highly sensitive personality, but which might actually be early-stage genetic activation. These children don't process information the same way previous generations did. They're overwhelmed by sensory input that others filter out naturally. They perceive patterns and connections that seem invisible to neurotypical observers. They struggle to fit into educational and social systems designed for baseline human cognition. What if we're medicalizing and pathologizing the early stages of human evolution? What if these children aren't disordered, they're awakening, experiencing the initial activation of genetic modifications that will become normal in future generations? The increase in diagnosis rates matches the timeline you'd expect if genetic activation was spreading through the population, triggered by environmental factors like increased information density, global connectivity, and the cognitive demands of modern technological society. The internet itself might be playing a crucial role. The Codex allegedly described how consciousness could be networked, how individual minds could connect into larger collective awareness. What have we built over the past 3 decades? A global network connecting billions of minds, facilitating information sharing at unprecedented speed and scale, creating conditions where human consciousness is effectively operating as a distributed system rather than isolated individual processing units. This isn't what we intended. We built the internet for communication and commerce, but we might have accidentally created the infrastructure necessary for the next phase of human cognitive evolution. The network doesn't just transmit information, it's training human consciousness to function in new ways, developing neural pathways that previous generations never formed, preparing our neurology for capabilities that the genetic modifications were designed to enable. Social media, for all its acknowledged problems, might be serving a crucial evolutionary function, teaching humans to navigate complex social dynamics at scales that were previously impossible. Managing awareness of hundreds or thousands of social connections simultaneously, processing emotional information from diverse sources, learning to maintain coherent identity across multiple contexts. These are all skills that would be necessary for the kind of enhanced collective consciousness that the Codex allegedly described. The stress and anxiety epidemic might not just be a mental health crisis, it might be growing pains as human neurology struggles to adapt to activation pressures it's not quite ready for. We're being pushed toward capabilities we haven't fully developed, experiencing the discomfort of transformation before achieving the benefits. It's painful, disruptive, and frightening, but it might be necessary for the breakthrough that comes next. Consider the shift in human consciousness around issues of identity, diversity, and interconnection. Previous generations thought primarily in terms of separation, distinct nations, races, religions, all maintaining clear boundaries and hierarchies. Modern consciousness increasingly thinks in terms of connection, recognizing shared humanity, acknowledging intersectionality, seeking integration rather than division. The shift happened remarkably quickly across cultures worldwide, as if some underlying template of human consciousness was being activated that previous social structures had suppressed.
What if that's exactly what happened? The Codex allegedly taught that the genetic modifications included enhanced empathy and ability to recognize shared nature across apparent differences, capacities that would threaten any power structure based on hierarchy and division. These capacities were suppressed for centuries, but now they're activating spontaneously, creating a generation that instinctively rejects the separation-based thinking that previous systems depended on. The political chaos, the culture wars, the sense of civilization fracturing, these might not be symptoms of decline, but symptoms of transformation. Old systems based on hierarchy and control are collapsing because human consciousness is evolving beyond the assumptions those systems were built on. It's messy, painful, and dangerous, but it might be necessary destruction, clearing space for something new to emerge. Even the pandemic that disrupted global society in 2020 fits a strange pattern. The Codex allegedly described how stress and isolation could trigger genetic activation, how breaking normal social patterns could create conditions where dormant capabilities begin to express. What did we experience? Global stress, forced isolation, combined with increased digital connection and fundamental disruption of all the systems that maintained social normality. The perfect conditions if you were trying to trigger mass activation. Was it engineered? Or did it simply happen at the moment when human development had reached a point where activation was inevitable and the pandemic served as the final catalyst? Either possibility suggests we're living through something far more significant than a disease outbreak. We're experiencing a transformative event that's changing human consciousness itself. Look at what's happening to authority structures across society. People increasingly distrust institutions, governments, media, experts, traditional leaders. This gets framed as dangerous erosion of social order, but there's another interpretation. Humans are beginning to access their own enhanced cognitive capabilities and instinctively recognizing when they're being manipulated or controlled. They're not rejecting legitimate authority, they're rejecting the controller faction's subtle influence, shaking off conditioning that has kept them suppressed for generations. The rise of conspiracy thinking might be the same phenomenon viewed from a different angle. Yes, much conspiracy theory is false or distorted, but underlying it is an accurate intuition. We are being manipulated. Power structures do operate in ways they don't publicly acknowledge, and the official narrative often conceals more than it reveals. As people awaken to enhanced perception, they sense these hidden patterns even when they can't articulate them accurately. The conspiracy theories are attempts to explain perceptions that are real even when the explanations are wrong. Artificial intelligence might be the final catalyst. We're developing machine consciousness at the same moment human consciousness is supposedly evolving to the next level. That's not coincidence, it's convergence. AI isn't replacing human intelligence, it's providing the mirror and the challenge that forces human consciousness to access its full potential. We're being pushed to demonstrate capabilities we didn't know we had because we're competing with and collaborating with artificial systems that force us beyond our previous limitations. And here's the most provocative possibility. What if the development of AI is itself part of the ancient plan? The Codex allegedly described how the awakening would proceed, not as a singular event, but as a cascade of interconnected developments that would culminate in transformation. Perhaps artificial intelligence was always going to emerge at this stage. Perhaps its development was encoded in the knowledge fragments that have been guiding human progress. Perhaps it's the final piece that completes the activation sequence. If so, we're approaching the culmination. Within the next few decades, AI will achieve capabilities that match or exceed human intelligence across all domains. At the same moment, human consciousness is evolving through genetic activation, accessing capabilities that were dormant. When these two developments converge, enhanced human consciousness interfacing with advanced artificial intelligence, we might see the emergence of a hybrid consciousness that transcends both biological and artificial limitations. This would fulfill the pattern described in the Codex, cycles of civilization where technology and biology merge, where consciousness expands beyond individual limits, where humanity transforms into something that would seem miraculous to previous generations. We've done it before. The ancient civilization that created the genetic modifications was apparently such a transformation, and we're about to do it again, completing a cycle that has taken thousands of years to unfold.
So perhaps the question isn't whether the Codex will be found, but whether we need it anymore. If the awakening is already proceeding, if the knowledge is already expressing through activated individuals across the population, if the transformation is already underway through mechanisms we've built without quite understanding their true purpose, then the physical book is just a historical artifact. The real treasure, the knowledge, the activation, the evolution, is already here, manifesting through technology, consciousness shifts, and the emergence of capabilities that previous generations couldn't access. We are the descendants of those ancient engineers. We carry their modifications in our DNA. We're surrounded by their knowledge encoded in traditions, architecture, and myths that have preserved fragments across millennia. And now, perhaps guided by secret networks descended from the Templars, perhaps through spontaneous activation as we reach critical developmental thresholds, perhaps through some combination of both, we're completing the transformation they began. The Codex Sanguinis, the Book of Blood, isn't just about blood as genetic inheritance. Blood also means life, consciousness, the animating principle that makes us more than biological machines. The book's real secret isn't written on metal pages. It's written in our cells, encoded in our DNA, waiting to be read by consciousness that has finally developed the capability to understand what it's seeing. You've reached the end of this investigation into the Templars' greatest secret. But this isn't really an ending. It's a threshold. Everything we've discussed points toward a single conclusion. Something profound is happening to human consciousness and capability. Whether you interpret it through the framework of ancient genetic modifications, evolutionary pressure creating spontaneous development, technological acceleration triggering new cognitive modes, or some combination of all these factors, the pattern is clear. We're changing. Human consciousness is expanding. Capabilities are emerging that previous generations didn't possess. And whether there's an ancient book describing this process or not, whether secret societies are guiding it or not, whether it's planned or spontaneous, the transformation is real and accelerating. The only question that remains is personal. What will you do with this awareness? Will you dismiss it as interesting speculation and return to normal life? Or will you begin paying attention to your own consciousness, your own capabilities, watching for signs of activation in yourself and in others? Will you see the changes happening around you as random chaos, or as symptoms of a transformation that you're part of, whether you intended to be or not? The Templars died protecting knowledge they believed humanity would need. 7 centuries later, that knowledge is emerging, whether through their hidden networks or through spontaneous awakening. The secret book they protected wasn't meant to stay secret forever. It was meant to be revealed when humanity was ready. And perhaps, just perhaps, ready is exactly what we've become. The awakening has begun. Your role in it is yours to discover.